Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Yevamot Daf Daled. Today's daf is sponsored by Ronit Aini on behalf of her son Yair Ezra. I'm finishing Masechet Megillah, Mazal Tov. And today's daf is sponsored for the Fuash Lema of Devorah Bat Eta Elka Michla. Okay, we are going to get started on our daf. We basically are going to be with this topic for a few days. We have this topic we started yesterday. I'll actually go from the beginning, which is we had all these crazy cases in the Mishnah. If you want, you can print out that long PDF and go through the process if you want. I mean, it's definitely not so good if you print it. It's much better if you visualize it and look through. I actually saw someone selling magnets that you could also like move people around and stuff. Anyway, there's all sorts of ways to visualize. But for right now, we're finished with those cases. The idea behind the cases is, and this is where we learned it all out from Achot Isha. Remember, let's just do some basic background. Normally, a man cannot marry his brother's wife, forbidden relationship. Comes the mitzvah of Yibum and totally overrides that and says, we don't care. When it comes to Yibum, there's some important value that's more important than that. If your brother dies without children, you, and the man, has to marry the brother's wife. And that's to basically perpetuate his name. That we've gotten. But what's important to remember about that is that's really an Isur Arayot. It's a forbidden relationship under normal circumstances. Even when the brother dies, it doesn't make a difference. You can never marry someone who is married to your brother. Okay? Next. What if the Yevamah is a forbidden relationship for some other reason to the man who she's now supposed to marry, to the brother? So the issue that it's your brother's wife, that we've overridden. What about any other arayot? So we learned from Achot Isha, remember it was a drasha on Achot Isha, which is you can't marry two sisters. Okay, you can't be married to two sisters at the same time, right? Or you can't divorce one sister and marry her sister if she's still alive. If she's dead, it said b'chayeha, right? If one sister dies after her death, you can marry the other sister. That's different than brothers marrying the same woman, right? These are two of the kind of two sides of the same coin almost, but sisters marrying one brother or brothers marrying one woman. So now that we say she can't do even if she falls to Yibum, right? In other words, not only is this a regular arayot, but it's not overridden by Yibum. Now, there's a whole drasha that teaches you that from the word aleha, because the word aleha appears by her, and the word aleha appears in Yibum, and Yibum is when there's a mitzvah upon you. Also, we're going to assume the pasuk that forbids this relationship is even in a makom mitzvah, meaning even when there's Yibum. So that's the drasha, basically. Okay, we have it now. Drasha is very simple. Aleha comes to teach you. You can't sleep with her even when it's a mitzvah. But the Gemara now questions the assumption of this. The assumption of this drasha is that, and we're going to have a bunch of this today, without the drasha, what would be a drasha is needed to build on what you would have thought. So the assumption of the drasha is if we didn't have a drasha, she would be able to marry the brother, okay? That he could marry two women who were sisters, okay? Now, again, the always easiest way to remember this is Yaakov Avinu, who married two sisters. Again, we're not discussing how he did that, but what he did was usher by Torah law, basically, okay? Torah law after Matan Torah, okay? There was no Torah law at that point, right? But again, there's debates. Maybe there was some Torah law, maybe there was that. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. It's a whole different discussion. But that's always the easiest way to remember. Achot Isha, Yaakov married to two sisters. So now, they're now saying and now we're talking about a Yibum situation, not a situation of marriage, but it sounds like without the drasha comes and says, if a sister falls to Yibum to her sister's husband, then, right, it's obvious, right? Two brothers marry two sisters. That does happen nowadays. It could very easily happen. Right? It doesn't always happen that they die childless, or the husband dies childless. But if two brothers marry two sisters and one sister dies, the husband dies, this sister falls to Yibum. Now, if we didn't have a drasha, you would have thought that you could do Yibum. Why? That's what the Gemara asked at the end of yesterday's stuff. And so we're working so I want to explain. The entire sugya that we're going to deal with now is all based on if we didn't have the drasha, it would have been that it overrides. And why is that? Because we have a principle. Ate ase v'dachelot ase. A positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. Now the Gemara has two questions. Number one, number two question is, where do we know that? And number one question is, even if we take that as an assumption, I'm saying it in a different order because I would have ordered them differently. Number one, where do you get the base? And not only did I order it differently, but when the Gemara answers the questions, they answer it in the order that I'm telling you. Okay, they answer question 2 first because it makes sense. The first thing you have to get is, where do we know that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment? The second question is, how do we know that when you have a positive and you have a negative, and the negative is very strong, that there's karet involved, like a rayot, how do you know that even so, the positive will override the karet negative, right? We're going to talk about this particularly in tomorrow's class about it being a scale, right? What's kind of more important? And you'll see, what if we put more things on the scale? Or what if we say this is a lighter lo taseh or a more serious lo taseh? So the whole discussion today is going to be the first answer to the question. We're going to see that there's 2 approaches, and we can only answer the question in the way we're going to answer it today with Rabbi Yishmael's approach. And tomorrow is going to be, how do you answer it with Rabbanan's approach, the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yishmael. But right now, our whole discussion, although we're going to get off on a bunch of tangents, as usual, is where do we know that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment in general, not in a karet case, not when it's a very serious one, first in general. We're going to then, the structure of the next 2 dapim is basically, we're going to have answer number 1, which is going to be from tzitzit and shatnez. Okay, we'll get to that. Then we're going to get to tomorrow, what about the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yishmael, who we're going to show today. Then we're going to have a bunch of attempts. At the end, they're going to get back to tzitzit, but learn it a little bit differently. And then we're going to have to understand, where do we get from karet? Okay, so today we're going to start with this. Dichtiv. Okay, so how do we know lo taseh greda, a regular lo taseh minal and dedachi? Those are the last words of yesterday's page. Question number 2. Dichtiv lo tilba shatnez, gedilim taseh lecha. 2 verses are juxtaposed in the Torah. Okay, in Sefer Dvarim, Deuteronomy, chapter 22, verses 11 to 12, it says, don't wear shatnez. Okay, tzemer ufishtim yachdav. Okay, they explain what is shatnez, in case you didn't know, although it's a little bit strange. What do you mean you didn't know? Didn't you read Sefer Vayikra before? And Vayikra, it already tells you this, but okay. The Torah tells you, we'll get back to that. The Torah tells you you can't put wool and linen together. Okay, then the next verse is, Gedilim ta'aseh lecha al arba knafot ksutcha. Okay, make gdilim, fringes, on your 4-corner garment, asher techaseba, that you're wearing. So juxtaposition of these verses comes to teach you, oh, well, guess what? You have a positive commandment of tzitzit, you have a negative thing not to mix. Well, tzitzit's going to override that. And in fact, tzitzit are usually made of linen with wool fringes. So there you have shatnez. Comes the Gemara and asks a zoom out question. Where do we get this idea of smuchim from the Torah? Okay, so now, so hold on. I see some questions are being asked. Hold off with your questions because these things will all be discussed much more in detail. Okay, we're getting out of the picture. We're going to go back into the picture and understand all the verses of tzitzit and shatnez, because both tzitzit and shatnez appear in other places in the Torah as well. Tzitzit appears in Bamidbar, with this last section of Shema that we say every day, and shatnez appears in Vayikra. So we're going to get to all that. So Rabbi Elazar says, where do we know smuchim in the Torah minayin? How do we know that we're allowed to learn things in this way by saying, oh, 2 things are juxtaposed? Let's learn a halacha from that. Okay, and by the way, I forgot to mention this, but once you have this example of tzitzit, that tzitzit overrides shatnez, from there we have what's called a binyan av. A binyan av means from here, this is a paradigm. We can learn from here to all other cases. So then we say, well, from here, we're going to learn to every case in the Torah where there's an aseh and a lo taseh, positive, negative. The positive is going to override the negative when it's a normal lo taseh, an average one. Okay, later we're going to have to say, what if it's karet and it's more serious? Okay, but which it's also going to override, but we have to prove it. We won't be able to prove it from here because this isn't a karet, right? Shatnez is not karet. So now the Gemara says, so Rabbi Elazar says, where do we get smuchim from the Torah? Shenemal, there's a pasuk in Tehillim which says, smuchim la'ad olam, things that are juxtaposed forever, asuyim be'emet v'yashar, are done with truth and in a straight manner. Okay, it doesn't exactly talk about smuchut parshiot, it's juxtaposition of text, but they learn from here a drasha. They say, from here you can learn that smuchin are truths. Okay, things that are juxtaposed teach you truths and the way to go, yashar, right, straight path. From there, you can learn smichut. The Amar of Sheshet Amar Rabbi Elazar, Mishum Rabbi Elazar ben Azalya, Minayin liyevamot shenafla lifnei mukat shchim. We're now going to darshan smuchin again. Okay, we're going to see some examples. A yevamot. Now we happen to come back to yibum, even though, right, this topic has nothing to do at this point with yibum. It was just to explain something about yibum, but now we're off about smuchim. How do you know that a yevamot, she's supposed to marry the brother of her husband who died without children? She comes before someone. The brother is full of these disgusting boils on his body. He has some disease. We don't force her to do yibum with him, right? On the one hand, you might say, well, you have no choice. You have to marry him. Which means you can't muzzle an animal while he's doing the threshing. That's like immoral to do that. Because it says when brothers dwell together, and that's yibum, the smichu parshiot of these two teach you that the word chosem, don't muzzle an animal. In this case, we're saying don't muzzle the woman and force her into a relationship she doesn't want to be in. Okay, so again, this is where I know people say, oh, nashim, it's so hard, women, mistreating, really, right? You see, and I'm going to show you many places, there's sensitivity to the place of the woman. If the woman doesn't want to, now there's a very interesting debate here. I did not have time to delve into it enough. Maybe we'll come across it in other places. I don't remember anymore, but there's a question here. What shows here is that you can't force the woman to do yibum. Basically, she's obligated in yibum, but she can do chalitza, right? In the Torah, who initiates chalitza? The brother. If the brother says, I don't want to marry this woman, then he can do chalitza. But the woman can also initiate chalitza, and that's what comes from here. The woman can say, I want to do it. But there's a debate among the commentaries. Does it have to be if he's a mukat shchin and she has a really good reason? Or can she just do it randomly? She's just doesn't want to. Now, obviously, when you get into understanding, if you look in the emotional state of a person, right? And it's, what does it mean? You need an excuse. What kind of excuse, right? Any kind of excuses. I don't like this guy, right? And where there's a scale of, mukat shchin, where you could maybe say, not only mukat shchin, but any kind of reason that she doesn't want to marry him might be sufficient to be able to say, I don't want to do ibum, we're doing chalitza. So how much of a role does she play in determining whether there's chalitza or not is a little bit comes out of, there's a debate that comes out of the sugya. Is it just mukat shchin, or is this basically building a paradigm for any time she wants, she can do that? So now, it's a really interesting topic, but again, not the central theme of our daf, so we're going to move on. Amar Rav Yosef, afilu leman delo darish smuchim ba'alma. So that was just an example of smuchim. Now they say, even someone who doesn't darshan smuchin in general, now we're going to learn, right? This is in the world of drashot. Okay, this is usually the school of Rabbi Yishmael and the school of Rabbi Akiva. And they have different ways of darshaning things. Okay, those are with the Hebrew Siyum. With Rabbanit Chana, she talked about these two paradigms also within the school of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva in Chagiga. If your Hebrew is good and you want to listen, it's up on our site from the Siyum. But anyway, there's always this split between those two schools. So here, Rabbi Akiva doesn't appear here, but they're basically going to make this distinction between people. In this case, it's not Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva. I was just kind of saying how using that as an example, there's different schools of drashot, right? They each have different ways of darshaning the Torah. That's why they're the most famous of different methodologies used when darshaning the Torah. But now, right, we say in our tefillah every day, the bright of Rabbi Yishmael and the Yud Gimel Midot, that's Rabbi Yishmael's approach, okay? Rabbi Akiva has a different way of darshaning. Here we're going to say, even those who don't darshan smuchim, ba'alma in general, b'mishnah Torah darish. But in Mishnah Torah, which is the last book of the Torah, Devarim, Sefer Devarim, he is doresh. Okay, now who is this? We're going to see Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, I confused you a little, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yishmael. I was just using that as an example for different styles of darshan, of how we darshan the Torah, principles that we use in guiding us. So Rabbi Yehuda, ba'alma lo darish. We're now going to say Rabbi Yehuda doesn't darshan juxtapositions and things like that in the Torah, but b'mishnah Torah darish. So again, we've veered from our topic entirely. We're now just talking about smuchim because our whole drasha was based on smuchim. And now we're talking about Rabbi Yehuda, who doesn't darshan smuchim, but he does in Mishnah Torah. Why is that important? Because our verses are in Mishnah Torah. So we basically want to say that everyone's going to agree with this, whether you darshan smuchin in general or you don't darshan smuchin in general. You don't think we can learn from juxtaposition. even the one who doesn't learn from juxtaposition does say in Mishnah Torah it works. So he's going to agree in our case as well. Now we have to show, number one, how do we know Rabbi Yehuda doesn't darshan smuchim? And number two, how do we know he does do it in Mishnah Torah and why? Okay, and there's going to be something that's not 100% clear. I'll just let you know as to why, how it works. We'll talk about it when we get there. So now the Gemara says, Uba'alma minalan delo darish. So how do we know that in general he doesn't learn juxtapositions? Ditanya ben Azai Omel. Here's a brighta. Ben Azai says, Ne'emal machashefa lo techayeh. Okay, we can't let any kind of sorcery, magic to survive. Okay, meaning anyone who engages in it will die. V'ne'emal kol shochevim be'emam mot yumat. Right next to that pasuk, it says anyone who sleeps with an animal, engages in bestiality, will die. Smacho and yamlo, those two verses are juxtaposed. We learn the punishment from one to the other because of smuchim. Okay, that's the drasha. Ben Azai. Amar le Rabbi Yehuda. You're going to use smuchim to basically stone somebody. Remember, stoning is the most severe. And Rabbi Shimon has it as second in severity, but it's still in the top two of severity. We're going to give someone a super severe punishment because it's juxtaposed to another verse where it says that. It's like a little bit crazy, Rabbi Yehuda says. He doesn't want to use smuchim. So he learns skila in a machshefa and a witch, or someone who uses sorcery. Again, exactly defined. I'm not going to define it now. But he learns that from a different methodology. Okay, all of them think it's skila. It's just a matter of that she gets stoned or he gets stoned. But the question is, where it's learned from. So now it says, Ela ov v'yidoni. Okay, these are people who bring up people from the dead. Remember the Baalat Ov in Sefer Shmuel when she brings up Shmuel from the dead. In Ov and Yidoni, b'chla machashvim hayu. They're part of this whole general term machshefa. But yet they're listed separately in the Torah. And there it says they get stoned. Vilama yatsu, why are they taken out and discussed specifically? Lahakish lahem v'lomar lecha ma ov v'yidoni b'skila, af machashefa b'skila. It's to teach you that just like their b'skila, any kind of witchcraft, magic, etc., gets skila. So now that's how we learned it. So from there, we've basically established Rabbi Yehuda doesn't darshan smuchim because he won't learn the punishment of skila from the smuchim. He has to learn it from something else. Now they ask, Uba Mishnah Torah minalan dedarish. How do we know that in Mishnah Torah he does learn smuchim? Titnan nosei adam. We're now back to our women and relationships and who's allowed and who's not. Nosei, not yibum exactly, but nosei adam anusat aviv u'mefutat aviv, anusat beno u'mefutat beno. Okay, start with a man rapes a woman, or a man seduces a woman. These are two cases described in the Torah as, a man taking advantage, and then there's a punishment, what he has to do. Even if she's willing, she goes in willingly, still he seduced her, he's somewhat responsible. I'm not going to get into the details of those cases another time, but both those cases, right? A man does something that's forbidden. He doesn't, right? So now, assuming he doesn't marry her, actually, if you rape someone in the Torah, you're supposed to marry them because otherwise they're right. In Torah law, again, this is something very hard to understand. In our world, in Torah law, that's a way of protecting her because once she's a rape victim, right, she's less marketable and therefore he needs to marry her to protect her for the rest of her life. Okay, but we're not going to get into that. This case, he didn't marry her. Okay, so we have a woman who's a rape victim of somebody. Now, if his son wants to marry that woman, he can. Okay, again, right. Forget about the reality here in the situation, but he can, according to Tanakama. Or if one's son rapes someone and the father wants to marry the rape victim, anusat beno, or the seduced woman, mifutat beno, you can, according to Tanakama. Rabbi Yehuda osel ba'anusat aviv mifutat aviv. He doesn't have an issue with the rape victim if it's your son who raped, the father can marry, but a son can't marry a father's rape victim. Where does he get this from? Well, we don't know, but Amar Rav Gidal Amar Rav. Rav Gidal says in the name of Rav, my time into Rabbi Yehuda, what's his reason? Dichtiv, there's this verse which appears very much out of context. Okay, it says, this verse is in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 23, the first verse of the chapter, Why is this a strange place? Because we're going to see it's all about forbidden relationships. And we already learned that all the forbidden relationships are in Vayikra, chapter 18, and then the punishments are in chapter 20. And that's where everything's mentioned. All of a sudden, randomly, toward the end of Sefer Dvarim, we have this strange verse. Lo yikach ish et eshet aviv. A man should not marry his father's wife. V'lo yigalek knaf aviv. And he shouldn't reveal the clothing of his father, the corners of the garment of the father, right? Back to knaf with the tzitzit. Whatever that means, okay, we're going to see. So clearly that last part of the verse is also somewhat unnecessary. Besides, number one, the location is strange. Number two, the second part of the verse doesn't really add anything to the first part. So what do they darshan from this? And we'll see in a minute how exactly. There's two different ways we'll see how it's darshan. That's later on in the bottom of this amud, this page. Kanaf shera'a aviv lo yigale. Okay, so what do we learn from here? Anything that any cloth that the father revealed, meaning any woman he slept with, lo yigale, a son can't. So what do you see here? A son can't sleep with a rape victim of the father. So now they say, umimai deba anusaktiv. Now, how do we know it's talking about a rape victim? Me'ila vedika, from exactly the verse before this. Okay, we said it's very out of context. Well, what's the verse before in chapter 22, verse, I think it's 29. It's the last verse of the previous chapter, and this was the first verse of the next chapter. It says, because the assumption here is that rape is they have to compensate the father of the woman. This is another strange thing. Again, all of this has to be understood in the context of their world. It cannot be understood in our reality at all, because rape in those days was very different than rape in our day. And the society was very different. The woman's place in society and the relationship, all of this was very, very, very different. So try not to ask all your questions from our world because it's not so relevant. Again, like the best example is that he marries her, right? That's a crazy thing. But in their world, it makes perfect sense because otherwise no one will ever want to marry this woman. And therefore it's a punishment for him almost, right? Because why? He just wanted to have a one-off and he ended up now having to take care of her for life. That means financial, everything, right? He has to give her what she wants, all sorts of things he has to commit to her. That's a punishment for him, not for her. Okay. So now, and it's an embarrassment to the family, right? Nowadays, you'd say it's for the woman, right? We always look at the person. We don't, yes, people are part of their family and it's embarrassment for the family, but nobody like family deal with it, right? It's the person we worry about the most, the victim. But in the Torah world, it was the family and the name, and it was a whole different society. So now they say the following. Because it says rape right before this verse, they learn, lo yiganek knaf aviv must be even, right, the beginning part of the verse is clearly his wife, but the second part must be including from rape. Okay, and there you have it. That's Rabbi Yehuda Darshan Smuchim. V'samech le lo yikach ish, and therefore that's it. Now the rabbis don't learn this. Why don't the rabbis learn this? So, because in theory, we said Rabbi Yehuda was the one who doesn't Darshan Smuchim. They should Darshan Smuchim. So why don't they think that this is the law? Remember, they thought you could marry your father's rape victim. Rabbanan said, if it really was juxtaposed, I'd agree with you, but it's not really juxtaposed. Why? And I'm going to read the part in parentheses, even though usually you don't, but it makes it very clear. Usually you don't read the part in parentheses because that's the part the editor is saying, this is in the text that I saw, but it really isn't supposed to be here. But this clearly explains it. It starts off with, right, the last verse in the last chapter is rape. The next verse says, don't sleep with your father's wife. And then it says, lo yigalek knaf aviv. Now it should have, if it wanted to juxtapose them, it should have started with lo yigalek knaf aviv, and then don't sleep with your father's wife. So the rabbi said this isn't juxtaposed because there's a section in between. It's only a half a verse, but it doesn't matter. It's a different topic in between. That splits between the two, so it's not smuchim. But Rabbi Yehuda views this as smuchim. And then the question is, so what do the rabbis understand from still unnecessary, lo yigalek knaf aviv? And we're back to Yibum. They learn b'shomeret yabama katuv medaber. We need to learn a few concepts, and these are concepts that are going to take us throughout Yibum, so it's good to get to them now. Shomeret yabam is a woman who's waiting to do Yibum. Okay, so let's go back to our case. Reuven and Shimon are brothers. Let's say Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Okay, there's three brothers. Shimon marries Yael. Shimon dies without children. Yael falls to Yibum, to Reuven and Levi. Okay, now she only is going to marry one of them. Okay, there's rules. Ideally, it should be the oldest, but it sort of doesn't matter. Until that's like a side thing. Until she marries either one of them, she is what's called, and there's a debate about whether there's zika or not, but she is zikuka, according to those who hold this way, zikuka liaben. That means she has to do yibum to one of them, which basically connects her to them. Now, they're not married, but it's almost as if there's something, and we're going to see it in this halacha right now, and you'll understand it better. It's almost as if they're connected through a marriage relationship, even though they're not. The fact that she's supposed to marry each of them already connects her. So now, here's a very interesting halacha that the rabbis learned from this pasuk. Because of this zikah, which they view as very significant, and one of these big things that go throughout this masechet, which happens in a lot of masechtot, there's machlokot that are very basically, and they're very basic, and you see them all throughout different cases, different approaches. How seriously do we take the zikah? Do we say there's zikah, or do we say there isn't zikah? Yeah, you're supposed to marry him, but there's no connection to you until you actually do yibum, okay? Or do we say, no, you're connected? So this halacha comes and says, she's basically at this point connected almost through marriage to Levi and Reuven. Now, if she goes ahead and marries Levi, okay, Reuven's son, and let's say Levi dies later, not Yibum, okay, he dies with children, she can never marry Reuven's son because at some point she had this zikah to Reuven. That's lo yigaleh knaf aviv. It's someone who your father never even slept with, but she was a shomeret yabam. Shomeret yabam means she was supposed to do yibum to him, even though, right, and it doesn't matter which brother I randomly chose. It doesn't matter. He was the oldest. She was connected to all those brothers. So any brother Shimon had can never, none of their son can never marry her. Okay, even though they never actually have relations with her or anything, we're never even married to her. That's what the rabbis learned from this. Okay, now we get back to this question about why Rabbi Yehuda darshans in Mishnah Torah. And here's where I said there's something not 100% clear here. I'll explain. But Mishnah Torah, my time at the Damish. Why does he not hold smuchin in other places, and specifically in Mishnah Torah he does? Now, what's different about Mishnah Torah in general? Mishnah Torah often repeats, right? It's called Mishneh Torah, second to the Torah. It's Moshe's speech to the Jews at the end of his life, and a lot of things are repeated, and always there's questions. Why are they repeated? Why are they repeated in this way, etc. This sugya is going to get to that. So, ibait ema mishum demuchach, v'ibait ema mishum demufne. Some people say it's because it's clear from the context that they were meant to be juxtaposed. We'll see what this means soon. And some people say it's because it's an unnecessary verse. Now, what's unclear here is, does this mean every single place of smuchin in Mishnah Torah has these are okay. Let me make it clear. These are two different explanations. Some people say this, some people say that. So some people say it's clear from the context. Other people say it's because the verse is unnecessary. The question is, do each of those people think that every single situation in Mishnah Torah is like this? That's where it's a little tricky. This doesn't necessarily typify everything in Mishnah Torah, although maybe it could. Like mufne, for example, means it's unnecessary. Why is it unnecessary? Because it was already said somewhere else in the Torah. So that maybe one could say is more clear, something that gets to all Mishnah Torah. In other words, my question here that I say is not 100% clear is, does this mean everything in Mishnah Torah will fall into these categories? Or does it mean that Rabbi Yehuda's dorish smuchin, if it has either it's clear from the context or it's unnecessary, and then it doesn't mean he darshans all over in Mishnah Torah, only if it falls into these categories. So the Gemara made it seem like every time in Mishnah Torah. But these answers, which explain it, aren't necessarily always found in Mishnah Torah, but maybe they could be. So I'm leaving as an open question, something that's not 100% clear here, what this means. So now let's explain. Okay, so let's go back to our case. We're on the knaf aviv, right? That was what he darshan smuchin. Well, it's obvious from the context that they meant to darshan smuchin because why? Because otherwise, it should have been in Vayikra. What's it doing here? If not to say, we want it juxtaposed to ones, rape, so that we can learn that you can't marry your father's rape victim. Maybe you'd say it's unnecessary. What's unnecessary in the verse? And this, you can see this answer is not unique to Mishnah Torah, really. This is unique to this verse. Right. The first one is maybe more obvious because it belongs somewhere else. What's it doing in Dvarim? Oh, must be to teach the context. But this one is less unique to Mishnah Torah in general, but in ken lichtav Rachmana lo yikach isha deishat aviv, lo yigarech chlaf aviv lamali, shma mina lafnuye. Okay, turning now to Amud Bet. They say here, the Torah could have just said, don't sleep with your father's wife. Why did it add lo yigarech chlaf aviv, if not to teach something additional? That's totally unnecessary in the verse. Because it's unnecessary, we're darshaning smuchim. So now we finally get back to our tzitzit case. Okay, so this was all to teach you smuchim. This wasn't to teach you our big question. But the smuchim was what stood at the basis of our drasha. So now let's go back and understand how Rabbi Yehuda, according to the two ways of reading Rabbi Yehuda, is it the context or is it when it's unnecessary? How would we understand by tzitzit the smuchin according to Rabbi Yehuda? Now, according to the rabbis, you wouldn't need this at all because they're darshaning smuchin all over the Torah, even without these excuses or explanations. So, gabei tzitzit nami, we're now going to explain according to both options. Those who say ibayt ema, one could say mishum demuchach. That's very easy. Same thing as the last one. Why does it appear here? Where does tzitzit come up? In Sefer Bamidbar, right? Near the Meraglim thing, right? After the Meraglim, it comes up, this whole section. That's what we say in Shema. So why does it come up there? Why didn't it come up there? Why does it come up here? It must be smuchin, to be right next to shatnez, to teach you tzitzit can be made of shatnez. So ibayt ema mishum demufne. Now, and this is what's going to we're going to deal with till the end of today and even tomorrow, is it's unnecessary. So what's unnecessary in the verse? And lo yigalech knaf aviv was very obvious. Which words were unnecessary? The question here is which words are unnecessary. So michtiktiv ubeged. So first they're going to try something and then reject it. Michtiktiv ubeged kilayim shanez lo yale alecha. It says in Vayikra, you can't put a clothing of shanez on you, meaning lo yale alecha, don't put it on you. It doesn't say don't wear, which it says in our pasuk. It says don't put on you. So now they say, well, if that's the case, though, okay, I already made some distinction, but let's assume, right? Just if you read that verse, you'd say, don't wear kilayim, basically, right? Don't put shatnez on top of you. But, and that pasuk, by the way, just so you know, says, lo tarbiyah kilayim, behem techa lo tarbiyah kilayim, don't crossbreed animals, don't lo tizra kilayim. It's all these mixing of different types. Don't take seeds and mix them together. And don't wear a cloth of mixed types. Okay, now, lo tilbash shanez lamali. So why do you need to repeat this in Mishnah Torah? In which they say, shema mina lafnuye, it must be a totally unnecessary pasuk, to which the Gemara says, no way, no how. This pasuk is very necessary because of the verbs mentioned in each verse. So now they say, no, hanai mitzrach tzricha. That pasuk is really needed. If you would say, don't place it on you, a mixed thing, hava amina kol derech hala'a sarachmana, va'afilu mochrei ksut. In those days, again, you have to put yourself into their world. This doesn't happen so much nowadays, although maybe once in a while it does, where people, right, normally we have mannequins now that wear the clothes and show it off. When they didn't have mannequins, what would they do? They would have people in the store owner would wear the clothing. Okay, now that's not called wearing unless it's freezing out and they want to wear it to cover their bodies, right? They're not wearing other clothing underneath or something like that. But if they're just modeling it, that's not called wearing. So if they model something of shatnez, that's not forbidden. You might say, why are they selling shatnez? I'm not going to get into that. But the question is, okay, this is what they're saying. Lo yale alecha, you would think, okay, so again, you would have thought any kind of way, even if you're selling it and you're not benefiting from it at all. Therefore, katav rachmana lo tilbash shatnez dumia delivisha ti'ipe hana'a. Because our verse says tilbash, it means no. You have to wear it in a way that you're benefiting. If you're not benefiting from the wearing, then no. V'i katav rachmana lo tilbash. So now you have to say, okay, well then it just could have said lo tilbash. So why do you need both? Well, if it had said lo tilbash, hava amina dafka levisha din nefesh hanayata. You might have thought it's only when you're wearing it where you're getting a lot of benefit. Aval ha'ala'a lo. But you might have thought, let's say I take a jacket and I throw it over my shoulders, right? Sometimes you do that. You're in a rush or you're not freezing, but you're not warm. You want to just throw it over your shoulders. That's not really called wearing. Let's say it was kilayim. Maybe I wouldn't be obligated, but no, I am benefiting. It's not the same kind of benefit as levisha. That's why it says lo ta'aleh. You can't even throw it over you if you want to benefit from it. Again, it's less benefit, but it's still benefit, and that's forbidden. So we have three dargot, three, right? There's someone who doesn't benefit at all and just throws it on top. That doesn't count. Someone who, right, and there it could be even you're wearing it, but you don't need it. Let's say it's hot out and you don't need clothing to keep you warm. So you're wearing these clothing just to model it to your customers, that you're not obligated. But if you're wearing it, not even wearing, you just throw it over, or obviously if you're wearing it, and in both cases you're benefiting, it's going to be forbidden. That's why we need both verses. So we're still looking for what verse is unnecessary. So now they say, well, im kain lichtov rachmana, the pasuk should have said, lo tilbash shatnez. It should have just said shatnez. Now, when you hear the word shatnez, it reminds you of what it said in Vayikra. And in Vayikra, it said, lo til beged kilayim shatnez lo yala alecha. Now, what is beged in the Torah? This is the big debate between Rabbi Yishmael and the rabbis. Beged in the Torah, we'll see in a minute. Michti katavu beged kilayim shatnez. Sorry, I lost my place for a second. Right. In ken katav rachmana lo tilbash shatnez. Samro fishin lamali. You don't need what materials is the beged made from, because michti ktav ktiv beged kilayim shatnez lo yala alecha. The word beged appeared in Vayikra. V'tana debe Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael's approach is the following: Ho'il v'ne'emru b'Torah stam begadim. We're now in a different. I'll already tell you what we're going to say, just so you understand as I read. Rabbi Yishmael's approach is anytime it says beged in the Torah, it means wool and linen. Those were the main fabrics, and anytime you see beged, it means that. And that's why Samar Fishin is totally unnecessary, because in Vayikra, it said beged kilayim shatnez, don't wear. Beged is always Samar Fishtim, and therefore we don't need Samar Fishtim, and therefore those words are unnecessary. That's the basic idea. So the question is, where does Rabbi Yishmael get this from? So he learns it from, it talks in Sara'at, leprosy of the clothing. Remember, there's leprosy of the person, leprosy of clothing, and leprosy of the house. When it talks about leprosy of the clothing, it says beged, and then it says ot semer o fishim, okay, whether it's wool or linen. So Rabbi Yishmael learns from there, since ho'il v'ne'emru b'Torah stam begadim, therefore there it said beged. And then, and in many places it says beged. There's lots of context, right, where it talks about impurity, it says beged. When it talks about all sorts of things, it says beged, like by us, shatnez. And in one of them, it specified wool or linen. So now, that was in leprosy. Called semer fishtin. Therefore, we learn from there again, it builds a paradigm for all the cases in the Torah. Wherever it says beged, it means semer fishtin. Okay, so therefore we learn that if it says semer ufishtim by us, and it already said in Vayikra that we're talking about a beged, it's obvious we mean wool and linen and not everything else. By the way, the simple reading of that verse in Vayikra really means everything, because it says don't plant kilayim, don't crossbreed animals. There's no specific which ones can't you do. And I mean, there's a little bit of specifics, but it's not so unique to just two types. But Rabbi Yishmael's drasha, and the rabbis don't agree with this. So the rabbis, that's going to be for tomorrow. Since they don't think Samru Fishtin is unnecessary, because they don't think beged in the Torah always means wool or linen, it could mean anything. So you needed to specifically say wool and linen, and therefore it's not unnecessary. But they're going to have to say something else is unnecessary, and that's tomorrow. But today we're dealing with Rabbi Yishmael thinks that Samru Fishtin is unnecessary, and that's how we learn. If it's unnecessary, remember there were two tracks. Either it was obvious from the context, because why did it say it here? It already said it. It's here to say you can do, right? Oh, ase overrides lo tase. Or you say it's mufne, it's unnecessary, which means because it's unnecessary, we can darshan smuchin. And again, ase del chalot tase. So you'd have to say beged means semer fishin always, and therefore it's unnecessary. Now the Gemara says, wait. So that's going to be our answer, but yet we're going to have a question on this before we finish. So now they say, akate itztrich. No, you still need semer fishtin. Why? So now they're going to suggest one thing, and then we're going to have a different question. Now remember, in Dvarim it said levisha, wearing. In Vayikra it said putting on. So you might have thought that when it said beged always means semer fishtin, right? When it said it there, it was limiting it because ha'ala'ah is less wearing. So because of that, it doesn't have that. Remember, we have the scale. No benefit, some benefit, a lot of benefit. When it's the middle category of not so much benefit, you might have said, that's when it's beged, only wool and linen you can't mix. But aval levisha, but when you're already wearing something fully, that you have a lot of benefit from, maybe kol treimine asa rachmana. Now to us it's so obvious the shatnez is just wool and linen because we've been brought up thinking that. But theoretically it should be putting any two things together, just like in the ground and just like animals, it's crossbreeding. So you might have thought it actually is a logical thought. Therefore, katav rachmana tzemer ufishtin. That's why it needed there. So again, you're back to it's necessary, which means it's not free to darshan aseh dachalot aseh. But they say no. If the pasuk was silent and didn't say anything, didn't say beged, didn't say, right, it said beged and vayikra, and there it says beged shatnez, and by us, it just says the word shatnez, and it didn't say tzemer ufishtin, you wouldn't have thought what we just said, because you would have said, oh, shatnez appears here, shatnez appears there. It's the same word. Whatever's true for shatnez there is true for here. So it would be only beged, and beged is tzemer ufishtin. Again, we're with the glasses of Rabbi Yishmael. Beged only means tzemer ufishtin, so you would have for sure learned it. You wouldn't have made this distinction, hala'ah versus levisha. No. So we're back to saying it's good. But now the Gemara asks a question similar to the type of question they asked yesterday, which is, according to the Tana, it's the exact same structure. According to the Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael, Tama de katav rachmana tzemer ufishtin, halav hachi kilayim b'tzitzit hava mina da asa rachmana. Say, no, wait a minute. This is all because we have a drashat, tzemer ufishtin. Without tzemer ufishtin, what would you have thought? The kilayim b'tzitzit, you would have thought that it's forbidden. In other words, the whole thing of tzemer ufishtin was to teach you tzitzit can be made of kilayim, right? A beged of pishtin with, right, a linen garment with tzitzit of wool. But meaning that you would have thought you couldn't do it. And the whole reason of tzemer ufishtin is to teach you can. But now they say, no, we could have learned that you can do it from a different verse here. It's obvious from Bamidbar. Why? Make tzitzit on the corner of your garments, fringes on the corner of your garments. Now your garments are made of wool or linen, right? That's what we just said. And what does it say at the end of that pasuk? They don't bring it here, but natnu al tzitzit hakanaf betil tchelet. Put tchelet on. Now what is tchelet? Tchelet, we usually think of the color, but it's not just describing a color, it's describing it's wool. It's this tchelet colored, this bluish, purplish colored wool. Okay, so now they say, well, if a beged could be linen and the strings are made of wool, that pasuk already tells you, and you don't need tzemer ufishtin. It's obvious from there. It's just like we asked by the woman, right? The woman's sister. Isn't it obvious without the drasha? The fact that there's a drasha means it's not obvious. So now they have to explain why. V'tana debei Rabbi Yishmael, they're continuing to explain this. Kol bigadim tzemer ufishtin, everything is wool or linen. V'amar Rachmana avid le'tchelet, and the Torah says put tchelet fringes, and tchelet amrahu. Tchelet is wool. So therefore, so first the Gemara says, Mimai tchelet amrahu. How do you know this? Midashesh kitana tchelet amra. Well, there's all these in the Psukim of the Mishkan. There's tchelet, there's shani, tolat shani, there's shesh. There's all these things. Shesh is known to be wool. From there we learn, and this is all learned out from the Big Day Kohanim. From there we learn that the tchelet is wool. Okay, the shesh is linen. From there we learn that the tchelet is wool, and that's an aside. But now getting back to our issue. So now they say, no, it's doif. You wouldn't have learned from that verse. Why? Because look at Rava. You would have thought like Rava said. What did Rava say? Rava brings up a contradiction between two psukim. He says, Ktiv hakanaf. It says, put it on the corner, which sounds like, what are fringes really, right? We take a string and we strand it through. But really, fringes are leftovers of the strings of the garment itself, right? Strings that are left over. So hakanaf means min kanaf, from the same type. The strings sound like the fringes are supposed to be from the beged itself, from the same type. Uktiv tzemer ufishtin, but then it says it's wool and linen. So how does this work together? Haketzad. So Rava learns tzemer ufishtin potrim be'minan ve'en shelo b'minan. You can actually put strings of tzemer ufishtin in any kind of beged. Okay, that works for tzitzit. Shar meaning, let's say you have silk. According to Rava, b'minan potrim shelo b'minan ein potrim. Silk can work as fringes only if on a silk garment. That's the difference between tzemer ufishtin and other materials. This, by the way, doesn't agree with Rabbi Yishmael at all, because Rabbi Yishmael thinks beged is only tzemer ufishtin and tzitzit can only be made of a beged. But anyway, we'll get back to that in a second. But the point is, right, so sharminim minapatrim, So when it says "V'natnu ala tzitzit kanaf batil tchelet," maybe that means tchelet on a wool garment, not on a linen garment. So that's why tzemer fishing is needed. So now the Gemara says, but how could you say that Rabbi Yishmael would have thought Rava? Hatan to be Rabbi Yishmael late to Rava. He doesn't know by Rava because he doesn't think it could be any other material. So he wouldn't even get there. But they said, no. He would have thought what Rava suggested at the beginning. And now they're going to explain it. With this, we'll finish our daf. Ha-kanaf min kanaf. He would have thought like Rava suggested at the beginning. Yes, according to Rabbi Yishmael, it's only wool and linen. So we wouldn't have gotten to the conclusion of Rava that we distinguish between wool and linen and other materials because there are no other materials to be discussed here. But he would have said, maybe, and we'll read it inside, Avidle v'hachikam rachmana. This is what the Torah said from kanaf, put on the corner of your beged. Avidle tzemer litzemer ufishin lepishim. When it says tchelet, it meant tchelet on a wool garment. But if it's a linen garment, it should be linen strands. That is what you would have thought. The chiyavidat tzemer litzemer. And then what does it mean, put tchelet? Well, when you do tzemer on tzemer, Save, color it in that blue. In other words, again, is tchelet describing the material or the color? If it's wool, then dye it this color. But from that verse, you wouldn't have learned kilayim, because again, the whole thing is we want to learn kilayim from tzemer and fishtin are unnecessary, juxtaposed to the verse on tzitzit. So we're going to learn from there, right? That one overrides the other. But couldn't you have learned that from the verse in Bamidbar that one overrides the other? Because it says put tchelet in your beged and your beged could be linen. No, because you might have thought put wool on wool, put linen on linen, but don't mix them together. That's why you need to write about tzemer lefishtinu, pishtin letzemer lo. And therefore, conclusion, we end very nicely today. Kata Rabbanit tzemer ufishtin, afilu tzemer lepishtin upishtin letzemer. Tzemer and pishtin are listed here together. Again, it's in the Shatnez pasuk, but it's once it's unnecessary, you can learn from their juxtaposition. From the fact that it's juxtaposed to tzitzit comes to teach you, comes the mitzvah of tzitzit and overrides the mitzvah of the lo taseh, the negative commandment of Shatnez. It was a very, all over the place stuff, but the conclusion is actually quite simple. But like I said, this is only Rabbi Yishmael who holds beged is tzemer and fishtin, and therefore those words are unnecessary. If you're the rabbis and you don't think beged always means tzemer and fishtin, those words are not unnecessary. They're to tell you that Shatnez is only tzemer and fishtin, and then you're going to have to find other extra words, or maybe not here. Maybe you'll have to find it somewhere else in some other context entirely. So there you have our daf. Have a Shabbat Shalom, everybody.